Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel, Bleak. This is Amanda, your host, and we are going to be talking today about Bryan Kohberger, specifically the Papa Roger account, and what law enforcement has said versus what the documents say, and I'm just going to share my opinion on that. So, and I apologize, you guys have to sit here and look at my face up close. I'm going to try to figure out a way to do these videos with showing pictures or something besides just me talking. I just haven't had a lot of, I work 7 days a week and I haven't had a lot of time to figure all that out. So hopefully one of these days you don't have to sit and look at my face the whole time. But anyway, so back to the subject. I really want to talk about this because it's something I've been discussing online in one of the Idaho chat groups on Facebook, and I've been kind of getting a lot of flack and pushback for it, but I want to get into kind of my thoughts and feelings on it and explain why I think the way that I do, and then, kind of see what kind of feedback I get from you guys. So anyway, I'm going to try to get into a little bit of the background in case you're not aware completely. I can't assume everybody is as invested in this case as I am or knows as much information as I do. So if you're watching this, I'm assuming you at least have some familiarity. Back in November of 2022, Bryan Kohberger, who has now pleaded guilty to this crime, savagely took the lives of Ethan Chapin, Xana Kernodle, Kaylee Gonzalez, and Madison Mogan in Moscow, Idaho. And he pled guilty, and there was a change of plea hearing, and then subsequently there was a sentencing hearing. Shout out to Olivia Gonzalez for the best victim impact speech I've ever heard. If you haven't heard that, I highly recommend you check that out. But anyway, for this video, I really want to focus on Papa Rogers. So after these homicides happened, there was about a 6-week period before Bryan Kohberger was arrested. And right after these homicides happened, a Facebook group was formed. And of course, people were really interested in talking about these homicides. And I think the reason it's such a, what's the word I'm looking, a riveting case, is because it's like everyone's worst nightmare. It's something straight out of a horror movie. Even now with these new documents that have come out, it's worse, I think, than a lot of people thought. These kids were desecrated, essentially. And I mean that with the utmost respect, but it's horrible. So, and of course, people, being that they had started investigating and they weren't arresting anyone right away, which would usually indicate, a boyfriend or an ex-boyfriend or somebody very well known to the victims, is kind of the assumption that's made in the beginning. So, and as nobody's being arrested for it, you start to think, oh my gosh, was this a stranger? And so this Facebook group gets made, and it's a discussion group, and it ends up becoming hundreds of thousands of people are in this group relatively quickly. It grows and grows. It's still a group to this very day. And as the group is getting bigger, a guy with the screen name Papa Roger, and I believe the Papa may have had 2 P's, and the Roger it wasn't plural, it wasn't Rogers, it was Roger, and it had a D in it, Rodger. And I don't know if I ever, when I ran across that name prior to the arrest happening, I don't know that I ever assumed I don't even think I thought about what the Roger meant in the name, because I do remember coming across this person and possibly even interacting with this person. So Papa Rodger made some interesting comments that nobody knew how significant they really were until after Bryan Kohberger's arrest. And the first one being, Papa Rodger makes this comment where he says, I'm paraphrasing here, but it was something to the effect of, the Moscow police have been going to like knife stores looking for a specific knife, which I believe that there was an article that came out saying that they had visited some knife stores. But then he makes this really big jump to, that leads me to believe they must have found the sheath at the crime scene, or he might have even said, that leads me to believe that the perpetrator left the sheath at the crime scene. And it was such a, it kind of, I think it got some people's attention because personally, I look at that like, that's a pretty big leap to make. It takes a lot of mental gymnastics to get from, the cops are looking for a knife, which we knew they were stabbed, so you kind of suspect if they didn't find the murder weapon, they're going to be looking for that knife, to get from the cops are looking for a knife to, oh, the perpetrator must have left a sheath. I don't see that as being like a normal, a normal connection or a normal place that your mind is going to jump to. For example, for me personally, when I read that article, my thought process was they might be able to get an idea of what type of knife it was based on the stab wounds of the victims. Like, that would be my first thought. But I would never, it wouldn't even occur to me to think, because in my mind, it's like, do I assume the perpetrator brought the sheath with to commit the murders? Do knives always have sheaths? I guess if that kind of knife, probably yes, but it's a very specific thing, and it is strange, especially in hindsight, right? So 6 weeks go by and Bryan Kohberger gets arrested, and pretty quickly after, the probable cause affidavit gets released by the Moscow Police Department. And the probable cause document gives you information as to how they linked the suspect to the crime. It doesn't tell you everything, but it tells you enough that, these are the main pieces of evidence that lead us to believe that this is the person that committed the crime. So that is when we found out about the knife sheath being left near the body of Madison Mogen. So right after we found that out, I think a lot of people, that comment that had been made in the group by Papa Rodger kind of came back to us as like, oh my gosh, there's one person in this group of hundreds of thousands of people, mind you, that made this comment about a knife sheath. And what's scary about that is it's a detail only the killer or law enforcement would know, right? And that's a tactic that law enforcement uses to catch people, is they don't release certain details to the public, and then if the person whom a suspect happens to know that information and somehow reveals it, that can lead you to that person being the one responsible for the crime, right? I mean, you see that in different TV shows and in real life too, in true crime cases. So what started to almost give you chills is when you look at the profile picture of Papa Rodger, it's a picture of, I would say, a man who's supposed to be a little older than Bryan Kohberger, but it looks almost identical to Bryan Kohberger, and it looked just like a little bit of an older version of him. And another interesting part about it is this person in this profile picture who looks like Bryan Kohberger is wearing a Russian soldier outfit. And what's interesting about that in particular is the capital of Russia is Moscow. And obviously these crimes occurred in Moscow. I believe there's a difference in pronunciation between the two, but the spelling of the city is the same. So it was almost like this Papa Rodger person was leaving a little Easter egg of like, you know, he's a Russian soldier fighting in Moscow. Like, it's a little bit creepy, right? And you put that all together, the knife sheath being left at the scene and this Papa Rodger having knowledge of that, the profile picture looking just like Bryan Kohberger, this whole Russian soldier reference. And then on top of that, I recall that Papa Rodger made a comment after, so a couple weeks into the investigation prior to Kohberger's arrest, the police made it known that they were looking for a 2011 to a 2013 white Hyundai Elantra. Now, it turned out they were a little off on the years. Not a big deal. I actually used to own a 2013 red Hyundai Elantra, and the body styles, between like 2011 to 2016 are all very similar. So you can see how they might not be able to be completely accurate on the year. But needless to say, they made it known that they were looking for this white Hyundai Elantra. And it was almost like the person who was Papa Rodger started to panic, and they started to say, oh, I don't think, they used the word red herring. They said, I think the white car is just a red herring. I don't think it's important. And, I think that, I don't know what they said after that, but they were trying to make it seem like this white car wasn't important to the case. And I think why Bryan Kohberger might do that in a group like this is to see kind of people's reaction. Like, will people be receptive to the police being incorrect about this white car? Like, I think he's starting to get nervous, and he's wanting to kind of see, like, will people entertain the idea that it's not this white car, or are they going to think, well, the police are saying they think it is, so we believe that they're correct? I don't know. It just seemed very much like he was concerned about it. On top of all of that, if you look into the last name of Rodger, and it's not spelled, again, I already said this before, but it's not spelled like the name Roger. It's spelled Rodger, which is more in line with it being a last name. And if you look into the last name Rodger, there was a mass murderer named Elliot Rodger who was a self-described incel. And if you're not familiar with incel, that means involuntarily celibate, meaning it's these very misogynistic men who feel entitled to having, sex with women, or having, a certain caliber of woman in terms of her looks. And they're not able to get a woman to sleep with them. And they feel entitled to a certain, society's version of a good-looking woman is, I think, and personally, I think that that's part of it. But Elliot Rodger, prior to his committing mass murder, he had a lot of Facebook videos, and he had a very long manifesto where he discusses a childhood friend of his named Maddie, whom it sounds like his parents and her parents were friends as they were little children. And Elliot Rodger talks about how when they were little, this Maddie was always really nice to him, and they would play as, like 6-7-year-old children. And she always treated him, equally, and they always got along really well. And then it sounds like they didn't see each other for a number of years, and then suddenly they saw each other again. And at this point, I think they're both around the age of 16 or so. And he starts to complain in these manifestos how as a child she was so nice to him, but then as a teenager, now she treated him like she was better than him and wouldn't really give him the time of day. And he talked about how she was really attractive, and he had a lot of anger towards her for them having a more of an awkward interaction. And he was very obsessed over this girl, Maddie, right? Like, she was the basis of a lot of these negative feelings that he had. And he mentions her, dozens of times throughout these 120 pages, I believe is how long the manifesto was. And so what's interesting about that is Kohberger, of course, his first victim that he took their life was Madison Mogen. What's even more kind of a weird coincidence, if anything, is the Maddie that Elliot Rodger was obsessed with had a mother whose nickname was Mo. I don't even know what her real name is because she went by Mo. So you've got this Maddie and Mo, right? And he kind of talks about her mother as well in this manifesto. And then you've got Maddie Mogen from the Idaho crime. So you've got these weird coincidences and connections. And when you start to pile all this together with the Papa Rodger account, you know, it's not just the knife sheath. It's not just the profile picture. It's not just the Russian soldier reference. It's not just the Elliot Rodger reference. It's all these things coming together. It's the fact that, you know, the profile was made specifically for that group. It's, you know, all these things, you put it together, and to me personally, I am 100% convinced that it's Bryan Kohberger, right? Like, I have no doubt in my mind. A lot of people were on the fence about it, and they were basically like, well, I'm not going to believe that it's him until I get direct a statement from law enforcement basically saying that it's him. And me personally, like, I don't need that statement, because it's kind of like I've been shown evidence. Kind of like with the Blake Lively situation, I don't need evidence anymore. I can say that she's lying because I've seen the evidence of the dance montage scene where she lied about how everything went down because she didn't think the audio had been recorded, right? So that's proof to me, you know, and it's like circumstantial evidence in a case, right? Like with the Papa Rodgers. I've been shown multiple pieces of circumstantial evidence, and it's piling up to a point where, and I'm sorry if this sounds cheesy to anybody, but it's just the way I look at it, I'm confident it's him, right? So I don't need law enforcement to tell me either way. Well, after Kohberger's sentencing hearing, of course, they had lifted the gag order, so any, you know, investigators could talk about the case, because prior to the gag order being lifted recently, nobody was allowed to talk about it. It was technically it's called a non-dissemination order, but it's technically a gag order, meaning certain people connected to the case or working on the case are not allowed to speak about it publicly or do interviews or anything like that. So after sentencing, the police immediately released a lot of the documents from the Moscow Police Department, and there's going to be more coming out as the judge has to look through and approve what he wants to be released and what he doesn't want to be released. And so at the press conference after Bryan Kohberger's sentencing, one of the very first questions that somebody asked was, is Bryan Kohberger, or was Bryan Kohberger Papa Rodger, on the Facebook account? And basically you get this answer from Brett Payne, who was the same guy that did the probable cause affidavit, saying, well, we couldn't find, you know, like they said, we exhaustively, you know, searched, and nobody could find a connection between Papa Rodger and Bryan Kohberger, and we couldn't find any online activity between, you know, Kohberger and the victims. And he didn't say, like, oh, well, we found a guy in, you know, Arkansas named Billy Bob, and he was, you know, he was actually Papa Rodger, and we could track the IP address. You know, they didn't say anything like that. They just said they couldn't find a connection. Now, in my mind, I was a little surprised by this, because I'm like, again, from what I've done with the research on Papa Rodger, I'm 100% that it's him, right? So when the police come out and they say, well, we couldn't find a connection, that to me isn't saying that it's not him. They did, I think, unequivocally say that it wasn't him, but they never gave any kind of reason that told me that they had proof it wasn't him. Now, what's interesting is, and part of the reason that I'm still continuing to believe that it's him, is they released like 320 pages of documents the day after the sentencing. And I have read all of those documents, and there's a page or a couple pages in there that deals with somebody from the Moscow Police Department who was tasked with checking these online profiles and looking into the Papa Rodger account to see if there's a connection to Bryan Kohberger, right? Because when they thought they were going to trial, if you can connect that account to Kohberger, that could be evidence, right? Because you have him talking in a group knowing about the knife sheath. Like, that would be evidentiary value. And so in my mind, I'm thinking, well, they had to have checked into this knowing that, right? Like, the police, I would hope, are smart enough to realize how important that could be, especially because they didn't know they weren't going to trial until like the last minute. Well, I'm reading through these documents and I'm kind of a little bit taken aback, because when they mention Papa Rodger, it says, you know, these search terms, and there's a list of different names and search keywords, if you will. It says, you know, these search terms were compared against the social media accounts of, you know, then they have a list, you know, Kaylee Gonzalez's Instagram, Kaylee Gonzalez's Facebook, Kaylee Gonzalez's Snapchat, and it's this huge list, right, and of all the victims. And Papa Rodger is listed there as one of the search terms. And the first thing that stood out at me is it's not spelled correctly in their search term. So when they're doing these search terms, they have some kind of database that contains all this evidence, right? They have the social media accounts, and, you know, they probably have a file from Instagram, for example, that contains, you know, Xana Kernodle's Instagram account and all of her activity, right? And so they're able to, whether it's with AI or another software program, they're able to say, okay, if somebody ever interacted with them that had the name Papa Rodger, you know, pull it up or whatever, and they can type in these keywords. Well, they have it spelled incorrectly, right? They have there's no D in Roger, and I think there's only one P in Papa. And so immediately I'm like, okay, so they cross-referenced it spelled incorrectly. Now, of course, you could say, well, maybe they typed it incorrectly, but this is an official police document that's telling me they typed it in incorrectly. So that's my first red flag. Secondly, they're cross-referencing Papa Rodger with the victim's social media profiles. Now, if you take a step back and you think about that, it makes no sense, right? Papa Rodger was an account made to discuss the investigation and the homicides after the homicides took place. The profile was created on November 30th. So you're not going to find activity from prior to November 22nd, when the homicides occurred, with the victims, because the profile didn't even exist at that time. So the police when they're saying we found no connection, it's almost like they have it backwards, right? Like, in their mind, they're thinking, well, maybe he used the Papa Rodger account to disguise his identity in order to interact with the girls online and somehow, you know, insert himself into their social media. But in reality, it seems like they're missing this very big point of, you can cross-reference Papa Roger all day long, but you're never going to find it, right? And instead of thinking he wanted to discuss the case with other people, and so to find out whether or not it's him, you have to be looking more into his devices. Now, what we know is Bryan Kohberger, and this has been unequivocally stated, that he wiped a lot of his electronic devices successfully. They used the word successfully. And on top of that, he was using VPNs, which is a private network that basically makes your search histories untraceable, or whatever your activity is. And my understanding is, if law enforcement go to look and see what you're doing on a VPN, it scrambles information to an unreadable format. And so to think that he was using a VPN, because if he's giving away information that only the killer would know when he's posting as Papa Roger, I mean, yeah, Kohberger made mistakes, but I think he's smart enough to know I don't want them to be able to track where I'm at if they see me out here talking about a knife sheath being left. He's not going to want that to be traceable. So, I'm sorry guys, but this document that came out saying, yeah, we checked Papa Roger, couldn't find a connection. Papa Roger is not a connection to the victims. That was never what anybody thought, right? Like, that was never something we even considered, because we knew the profile was not made until November 30th of 2022. And so it sounds like the police only cross-reference Papa Roger with the victim's social media accounts, and then they use that as a way to say, we can't find a connection between Kohberger and the victims, and they use Papa Roger's as one of his possible accounts to cross-reference. And so anyhow, I made a huge long post about this in the Idaho Facebook group, because I was trying to explain to people, like, look, I know that everybody thinks now the debate is solved and that we now know that Bryan Kohberger isn't Papa Roger, but I explained everything I just explained in this video. And I basically said, like, look, the police, I'm going by their own document, and I'm not going to rehash it, but they, everything I just said, and I said, so as far as I'm concerned, Bryan Kohberger is Papa Roger. There is no way that out of sheer coincidence, the same person who knew about the knife sheath being left just so happens to coincidentally use a profile picture that looks just like Bryan Kohberger, who happens to coincidentally pick a screen name that chooses a mass murderer named Elliot Rodger, who happened to be obsessed with a girl named Maddie, who is also somebody that people that knew Kohberger said that Kohberger seemed to kind of admire Elliot Rodger, who also tried to deter everyone from thinking the white car was important. The list goes on and on and on. And if it was just one of those things, I might be able to say, okay, that this person just got lucky or it was just a coincidence. But when you start having all these coincidences with the same person, that's what circumstantial evidence is. And I'm not trying to be rude or mean or say, like, I know, like, I'm better than anybody or I know more than anybody else. But it's almost like it defies critical thinking and common sense to think otherwise. And you've got all these people going on, there was Dr. Gary Bricata was on a show, and he's like, I knew he wasn't Papa Roger, and I knew he was more, inspired by Ted Bundy and not Elliot Rodger. And it's like, does it really matter? First of all. And second of all, it's possible he was inspired by more than one psychopath, right? Like, he could have gotten certain things from Ted Bundy, and he could have gotten other things from Elliot Rodger. So, in my mind, unequivocally, he is Papa Roger. I believe that if the police had traced it to someone else, that they would have said so, and that person probably would have even come forward and explained it, and they're not going to, because no such person exists. I'm telling you this with 100% certainty. If I'm somehow end up being wrong about this, which I'm not, but if I will eat my words and apologize, but I am telling you guys that I respect law enforcement. I think they did a really good job overall in this investigation, but they're not perfect. They are not gods. They make mistakes. Maybe they didn't prioritize the Papa Rodger part of it. Maybe the person doing, tasked with making those connections didn't quite understand that nobody was implying that Papa Rodger was interacting with the victims. And, it could have just been that there was a misunderstanding. For example, when I start reading through these documents, you had a police officer who was describing Xana Kernodle's injuries, the entire document, and calling her Kaylee. Like, Kaylee was found on the second floor. Kaylee was found in the same room as Ethan. Well, that's not true, right? We know that Xana, and, sadly, Xana had over 50 stab wounds. Like, poor girl, bless her heart. That's awful. But I knew that they were talking about Xana, and they were calling her Kaylee. Now, that did get corrected a couple of pages later, where they talked about, or they clarified that originally they had the wrong victim's identity that they were referring to, but they still left it in the report, and it's still a pretty major mistake to make. And it's a pretty basic thing, yet they made the mistake, and they made it repeatedly. Another thing that comes to mind is you've got, I don't have a huge problem with Bill Thompson. I think he seems like a competent prosecutor. I always thought he was really well-spoken in court, and I would have liked to see him, as a trial lawyer. I would have liked to see him in trial just for my own, I think he would have done a good job. So I'm not saying this to be rude to him, but when he got up there at the change of plea hearing and he talked about there not being a sexual motivation with Bryan Kohberger, and he said it more than once, and he said it basically he was like, well, the girls didn't get, I'll say, graped. So there was no sexual motivation. Well, that doesn't mean that the crime itself was not motivated by sex, right? Like, it's actually, if you look at these types of crimes, 99% of the time they're sexually motivated. So to come out unequivocally and say there was no sexual motivation, well, that's not his place. First of all, no forensic psychologist would ever say that we can say for sure that there was no sexual motivation. He could fantasize about the crimes while he's pleasuring himself at a future time, right? Like, that could have been the sexual part of it. He could have had plans thinking Maddie Mogan was by herself, and then those plans were interrupted because Kaylee was there. So, yes, these men and women and these investigators do a great job, and I'm not saying that they don't, but they make mistakes, and they're not perfect. And they say things that aren't always correct. So, Papa Rodgers is Bryan Kohberger. The police have not come out and said that they have connected it to another person. And just because they couldn't find a connection doesn't mean they can say it's not him, as they've been saying. I don't think you can say that just because you couldn't find the connection. Because we know Bryan Kohberger tried to cover his tracks, and he did in a lot of ways. So anyway, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Please keep it nice. I sometimes get frustrated when I feel like people just aren't using common sense, and it's not that everyone has to agree with me, but, I prefer when people are talking from a place where they've actually done their due diligence and done their research and everything. So I would love to hear your thoughts on how you think it would be possible for it to not be Bryan Kohberger, but for all these coincidences to exist. Because I just don't see how that could ever be true. Anyway, that's all for now. Thanks for listening, and I hope you guys have a great rest of your day or night or whatever time you're watching this. Bye-bye. Ta-ta.